And welcome back to the podcast, everyone. Hope you enjoyed the new intro music. Sneak peek of one of Pat Flynn's new cover songs. That little soundtrack you heard there is actually AC/DC's Gone Shootin', one of my favorite B tracks. And Jim is already starting show and tell on Freaky Friday. What do you have there, Jim?
That is an inverted gear club.
How much?
I literally, it's a 25-pounder. I literally brought this to the office today and went and worked out at the student rec center between classes because it was too cold in the garage for even me. So,
well, I mean, since you brought it up, gentle listeners, don't forget to take 15% off your next or first order at invertedgear.com/discount/PatFlynn15.
There's nothing like bringing a 25-pound steel club to your place of business too. So.
I love it, man. Yeah, that's awesome. By the way, real quick, gentle listeners, lots of good questions already here. We will be tending to those. It's Freaky Friday, so all is fair game. Drop whatever questions you have. Now would be the time to do it. I also have to give a shout out to our other sponsor very quickly, and her name is Sarah Bussey over at MagdaleneDesignCo.com. So if you check out our new website, philosophyforthepeople.com, what you should do, you'll notice that it's beautiful. It's exquisite. It's immaculate. It's perfect in every way. Well, if you want your own exquisite, beautiful, perfect, and immaculate website, please check out MagdaleneDesignCo.com. You might be thinking, well, why do I need a website? Well, maybe you want to start a business. Maybe you want to put up some tribute to your dead iguana. Whatever the reason, Sarah can help you out. And if you tell her that you know Pat and Jim, good old Pat and Jim, she's going to hook you up with a really great deal. And I have to say, guys, in all honesty, I've had a lot of websites designed throughout the years. This was by far the best experience. Sarah understands elegance. She understands simplicity. She understands marketing. So if you are in the market for a website, please visit MagdaleneDesignCo.com. Jim, good afternoon to you. How you doing, my friend?
Doing well. Good afternoon to you, man. Happy Friday.
I see people already freaking out that we're switched sides on the screen.
Yeah.
We do that.
This is what happens when you give me access to the StreamYard account, right?
Mm-hmm. So before we hit the questions, what was your actual workout routine today?
I did 20 minutes of. I did a 10-minute warm up, and I did 20 minutes of club swinging, following a program by Mark Wildman, which is a really, really good introductory club program. And then I did 10 40-yard dashes. And did a cool down and came back up here.
When you're doing your dashes, flat or hill?
Preference is hill, but it's 1 degree out there. So I did them on the AstroTurf. They have a little 40-yard AstroTurf patch in the student rec center. So I did them there. So
nice. Any of the students ever come and work out with Professor Madden?
I think they know to leave me alone when I'm not being paid to talk to them, but they noted that I was there, though. Yeah,
that's cool. That's
I always tell my students, if they bump into me in the street, I say, I'm not being paid to talk to you right now. So,
right, this isn't office hours, kids.
This isn't office hours.
What is Professor Madden like in office hours? Is he straight business? Like,
yeah,
okay, here's the answer to your question. Now get out.
Yeah, exactly. Was there another question?
Right. Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah.
Good morning. The Brits use good morning or good afternoon as a way of stopping a conversation.
Oh, is that right? That's very funny.
In the middle of a conversation, they might say good afternoon, meaning I'm done speaking with you. Move away. Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So anything else you want to say or announce before we start getting to?
No, nothing new. Nothing new. Yep.
Yeah. I always feel like I have something that I'm forgetting to mention. But you know what? I'm not going to waste any more time. Let's go to some questions. This first one's from Brendan. He says, hey guys, how long does it normally take to go from average dad to pretty good in the fitness game? And is 3 days a week reasonable to maintain after you get there? Yeah, I'm going to say for anybody who's thinking like this, give yourself a minimum 3-month commitment before you sort of do any self-evaluation or critique. I think the length of a season is a reasonable commitment in terms of just being realistic with yourself. But before you make any like grand judgments about your approach or your plan or your protocol, the length of a season, I think 3 months is realistic enough that with a reasonable program, meaning you don't even have to be crazy or hyper aggressive, you can see substantial differences in 3 months. Jim, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I agree. And I agree 100%. And excuse me, you have to do that one program for 3 months. You can't hop around. It's not just three. You have to, like, whatever it is you're doing, stick with it for 3 months and see what it gets you.
Yeah.
And partly, what Brendan means, excuse me, by pretty good in the fitness game. Yeah, I mean, I guess he could mean a lot by that, but I think someone can get into, if you're not starting out at 450 pounds, right? Okay. Which we're not quite there yet as the average dad, but give it another 10 years. But if you're not starting out like 450 pounds, you can probably get yourself into pretty reasonably good shape in 3 months if you are very, very strict with whatever program you're following.
Yeah, you make the good point that you can't be program hopping for 3 months. And in fact, this is why for any of my online coaching, it's a minimum 3 months. And the reason we do that is 3 months is a realistic amount of time to make progress that I think any reasonable person could, joyfully celebrate. But also 3 months is enough time where you can really start to build some stable habits and dispositions as well. And it's for those two reasons, I think a minimum 3 month commitment is the reasonable way to go there. Mm-hmm.
Agreed.
And yes, 3 days a week is, absolutely, man. If you're doing 3 days a week, I would typically recommend sort of full body routines, full body training. If you're doing more than 3 days a week, I would start to consider split body routines there.
And if you're looking to just become a reasonably fit, competent human being sort of thing, check out Paul Rourke's Core Strength. Right, that is a very, very kind of idiot-proof way to get there.
I think I bought that book because of you, and then I never read it.
Yeah,
I'm actually pretty bad at reading the stuff that Jim recommends to me. This is unusual. I'm a great reader, but there's 2 books you've recommended to me that I got that I haven't read: The Agnostic Inquirer and Core Strength. They're both still just sitting upstairs unread.
Core Strength is just it's one of those programs. If you do this thing line by line, the laws of physics apply to you. You will get in better shape, right? It's not easy. It's not an easy program, but it's not like it's not beat down CrossFit every day, right? And it's something that works. So, for instance, my son who's in the Marines is doing that program right now, like a young, fit, tough kid. But also, I would have no problem putting like a 60-year-old guy on it either, right? I mean, I think it scales really well. So.
Yeah, awesome. Jim, you have control here too, man. So don't let me pick all the questions today. Go hop in and just grab whatever.
Should we go right to Brendan's second question, or should we move?
Yeah, pull it up. Brendan, you get a 2 for today for being early, my friend. He says, I was also wondering how naturalism fails to comport with the Aristotelian worldview. A YouTube content creator recently expressed that he thinks Aristotle is the solution for secular society. Cool. So I actually want to celebrate that. Celebrate that sort of that realization. I think Aristotle has a lot of good solutions, good answers to difficult questions that have been abandoned by many thinkers for no good reasons, and have invited a host of problems that have not been solved, and I would argue cannot be solved until we start to return to Aristotle, right? So, and I've also said on the record that if I were a naturalist and I was going to try and be as resilient to theism as possible, I would do my absolute damnedest to be an Aristotelian naturalist, and I hold by that, because I think a sort of Aristotelian paradigm can do a lot of work. It can do a lot of work on a proximate level, especially for things like morality, right? I think if you have a sort of Aristotelian essentialism, you kind of have what you need to do a lot of moral reasoning, to hold on to our moral intuitions and a moral objectivity and stuff like that. Why do I ultimately think it can't be sustained apart from atheism? I mean, the short answer for that is Aquinas and first cause arguments, right? It's the deeper metaphysics, right? The metaphysics of existence, the real distinction between essence and existence, thinking about how there are facts that are not self-explanatory, especially when it comes to existence, and how in order for reality to be completely intelligible, we need at least one self-explanatory fact. and then thinking about, well, what could the nature of a self-explanatory fact possibly be? I don't think it could be anything other than a purely actual reality, staying within that Aristotelian paradigm. So I think ultimately, in terms of ultimate explanations, you're going to have to cash it out in terms of a very traditional theism. But you can go a long way, just sort of on the proximate level as an Aristotelian, I think, before you really have to kind of bring in God to sort of underwrite the entire system. Some general and somewhat vague thoughts there, but Jim, please chime in. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, and also, like God does underwrite Aristotle's entire system too, right? I mean,
yeah, and Aristotle was a theist, right?
Yeah. I would not, though. I mean, I think it's a an anachronism to refer to Aristotle either as a naturalist or not a naturalist, right? I think that distinction is something that it's only going to come up as we think about it in like post Galilean, right,
Mm-hmm.
context, right? So I don't like when Brendan asks, is Aristotle a way of like a counter to naturalism? Well, no, but he's not for it either, right? It's a the kind of question that naturalism is answering doesn't really stand up for Aristotle, because he hasn't distinguished the natural from the supernatural like Aristotle has a sense of a nature that's very much enchanted, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I think that's an important thing. As far as Aristotle being a solution to the ails of secular society, I'd have to, a lot of times I find that as a curious claim. I'd have to see what was actually claimed there, right? I obviously am deeply committed to Aristotle in ethics, right, okay, but the idea that you're going to have like some kind of like society-wide Aristotelian project at this point would be kind of naive, right? and would probably be odious at certain levels too, right? Does that make sense? Right.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I had another thought that just slipped my mind. So, gentle listeners, if I've been off these past like 2 weeks, my whole house has been a museum of diseases, like literally.
Right.
It has been the museum of diseases. So, stomach issues, all sorts of whatever it is going around. So you'll have to forgive me if I'm just
Right.
in and
Right.
out of lucidity here.
Right.
Good question though. Yeah.
But I'll say this is just in general, like I see myself as a kind of Aristotelian at the end of the day, right? Yeah.
Big Tent Aristotelian.
Aristotelian.
Oh, that reminds me. That's what I wanted to kind of mention. There was an interesting conversation that happened just the other day. Jim, I don't know if you got a chance to catch it, but it was between my friend Josh Rasmussen, great philosopher, and a guy that Jim, you've mentioned his work before, Philip Goff, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think it was just really interesting conversation. Did you catch any of it, Jim?
I haven't caught it yet, but
okay, so I'm not gonna
it's on
spoil.
the,
I'm not gonna spoil it, but both of them agree that mentality is woven much deeper into the fabric of reality than many sort of certainly modern materialists would
Right.
admit or grant, right? So a sort of, I guess, a broad panpsychism. They're in agreement there. And there's a part in the conversation actually where it seems like they agree, and Goff agrees, that at some point we have to get to something that's self-explanatory, right? But then Goff kind of pushes back, I guess, against Rasmussen in the sense that he's just like kind of like completely agnostic about we just don't understand what the nature of something like that is. And it struck me, I wrote a brief blog post on this over at philosophyforthepeople.com, where I actually largely agree with Goff on that. But I think he's missing really the whole tradition of negative theology, right? Yeah. So like traditional metaphysicians don't think that a lot of them sort of reject these traditional ontological arguments, and we don't think that we grasp God's essence perfectly and we can just sort of see, because we can wrap our mind around the essence of God, his necessary existence and perfect freedom and stuff like that. Rather, what we do is we say, okay, here's the things that we know are definitely not self-explanatory and could never be. Here's these classes and categories that just are not self-explanatory, especially for when
It's
it
not
comes.
one of these. It's not one of these. It's not one of these. Right.
Right.
Yeah.
It's not composite things. It's not changing things. It's not contingent things. It's not finite things. So whatever else the self-explanatory fact is, it has to be qualitatively infinite, non-composite, purely actual. And I would say that does actually give you enough then to deduce the traditional divine attributes, while still being able to agree with Goff that we don't grasp the essence of that, right? And we can't grasp the essence of that. But you don't have to grasp the essence of that coming from a traditional metaphysical project to still have confidence that that thing exists and and we can know enough about that thing through the negative theology to say that that is the God of classical theism. You see what I'm saying, Jim? So I'm trying to be like, agree with Goff, but at the same time think that he's kind of missing something really important there.
Yeah. My sense in having read Galileo's Error, not his other more like technical work, but Goff was a great example of someone, and I think you can find this on both sides of the atheism theism debates in contemporary philosophy, who I just think is confusing might be the wrong word, but they're just like too closely associating classical metaphysical theism and the the, the biblical stories. Okay, and I'm not saying they're just stories or anything like that, but my point is like it's as if like the only way we can think of this game is like what the theist is up to is ultimately trying to justify like this is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, right? And the only thing that we can conceive the atheist is doing is like trying to stop us from getting there. Do you know what I mean? And so then it leads to this way of thinking about the discussion that I think it's artificial, and it misses like what is like the real serious points on the philosophical level all the way through, right? And so, because I know like what's like you and I would say what you just said, right? And like someone like Goff would say, well, okay, but you're gonna put more meat on those bones when you start talking about the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and you're not just gonna be negative there. And okay, fine, but let's just leave that aside. Can we just talk about whether or not like philosophical theism works or not? Like this is why I want to like take all of this out of the apologetic context, right? And say nothing rides on it. Let's just suppose nothing rides on it for whether you go to church. Okay, nothing rides on it for how many children you have. Okay, just leave that alone. And just ask ourselves, like, what do the metaphysics show here? Do you know what I mean? Because everybody is importing, I think, on both, not everybody, most people on both sides of the debate are importing this. They're trying to rig the game to go someplace, right? That may have nothing to do with the actual issue that we're discussing. Do you see what I mean?
Oh, yeah.
I think that's a case, like, I didn't watch the talk, but it sounds to me like that's a case where you have Goff is like, doesn't even want to entertain like negative theology, because as soon as you do that, it's going to be like, it's going to like start to whiff of the biblical story and stuff like that. Let's just leave that alone. And because I think it is a jump from like what we do in natural theology to the biblical story, and it's a long way to get there. And plenty of people have bought into natural theology who did not buy into the biblical story, right? And that's why I want to keep these things completely separate. Yeah.
And there's people, I disagree with them, who think that the natural theology we're talking about is incompatible with the biblical story.
Yeah, exactly. So
yeah, no, that's a great reminder, Jim. Yeah, I think that would go a long way to advancing these conversations if that was kept in mind. Mm-hmm.
Right.
All right, moving on here.
And I'll say, and having had the impression from reading Goff's book, it does seem like he just assumes like what the theist is talking about is this Zeus-like character, right? Okay. Yeah.
Anyways, I want to finish that conversation before I comment, because I haven't been able to finish it, but it was very interesting. So I recommend people check it out. Danny has a question. He wants to know if you can explain Wittgenstein's private language argument, and do you think this is something that might be used to refute solipsism? Solipsism is back. Yeah. Always wondered why there weren't more solipsists like me around.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm not going to go into the details of it because it would require an hour-long episode in and of itself. But we'll do one. I'm actually teaching this material this semester, so it'll be an easy episode for us to do on Wittgenstein's private language argument at some point in the coming weeks. So we'll commit ourselves to that if that's okay, Pat.
That's fine. Yeah, we can do an episode on that. Yep. Mm-hmm.
But I do want to say, because I'm like always the snotty, picky professor, right? So I want to say a couple things about the question, though, right? So, is the private language argument like something that you could use to refute solipsism. I would not say it's not out to refute anything, right? And I think what Wittgenstein is doing, you could always say, I mean, look, you could always say, well, couldn't I just be dreaming that this was the argument that I heard, right?
Yeah.
Okay,
Real quick, let's explain what solipsism is, just for
yeah,
people who
go. So solipsism is
people who don't swim in the insane asylum. That is,
exactly.
That is philosophy.
So solipsism is the notion that I'm the only mind. That the only thing that exists in the world is my mind, right? I'm a mind, and the only thing that exists is me. Okay. And so the external world doesn't exist, other people don't exist, right? The solipsist is at least entertaining the possibility that that's true, okay? And, the solipsist could always say, well, it might just be an illusion of yours that Wittgenstein's argument is a good argument, okay? And so I'm not saying, and I don't think Wittgenstein would say that he's going onto the solipsist territory and giving some piece of evidence or refutation of solipsism, right? What he is doing, though, is just to show that if we take the way human beings actually use and acquire language, right, and what human language actually is, right, it comes with it. Along with that comes a heavy commitment to a kind of externalism, right? That to say that my very mental content, in as much as it is linguistic, is going to require some kind of commitment to what's outside of me. Okay. But once again, that would seem to make it hard to be a solipsist. Okay. But it's not intended as a refutation of it. Right. Mm-hmm. If that makes sense. But we will go into great detail on that in some episode.
Do we want to say anything more about solipsism? Danny, are you a solipsist?
Yeah.
It's I was talking to our friend John DeRosa the other day, Jim, and I told him, like, sometimes I think, and I mean this in all sincerity, and I really do mean it as an insult, that, like, I wonder what the difference would be sometimes between, like, going to, like, a party with a bunch of professional philosophers and then immediately going to, like, a mental ward full of schizophrenics, right? Like, would I be able to,
the difference?
Would I know the difference? You see what I'm saying, right?
Yeah.
And, like, I break it, like, because both of us read a lot of philosophy, man, and there's just a lot of just straight up insane stuff.
Yeah.
Right. It's like, man, if this, like, weren't in this context, people would be wondering how you got over the wall at the asylum.
Exactly.
They would.
Yeah.
And and, like, intelligent people too. Like, it's funny, we just did this series on Bertrand Russell, and it seems like there was a time when he kind of flirted with solipsism, right? And
Wittgenstein, in his argument against private language, has basically Russell in mind, right? Well, he has Wittgenstein as the author of his earliest work, right, and Russell, right, in mind, with the argument against private language, right?
Yeah. So, it's always, I think just in relation to solipsism, and then also just like radical skepticism, and solipsism, to my mind, just is a form of radical skepticism, is that whatever else philosophy should be doing at the end of the day is it should be bringing greater clarity, illumination, articulation, explanation to common sensism, right? It should help make better sense of and secure our deep intuitions. And I mean, at some level, especially if you're a solipsist, right? You're really sort of undermining all the intuitions and stuff that could even cause you to consider solipsism in the first place, right? So I think there's a deep sort of self-defeat in these radically skeptical scenarios when you ultimately kind of unpack them, right? Which is traditional type of response to radical skepticism. But also, I think, I'm pretty committed to, like, a Plantingian proper functionalism, right? And I think that's, again, where theism has a great explanatory advantage, right? Like, can I trust my common sense intuition that I'm not a brain in the vat, or I'm not the only mind that exists? Well, that depends if that intuition's functioning properly, right? And there's almost a circularity worry there. You see that? But it's not a vicious circularity if God exists and proper functionalism is true. You see that? But it's not something that we can avoid circularity entirely about. But I would say you can avoid viciousness if you have reasons to believe in God and proper functionalism. And then you can just sort of very much rely on that intuition to give you all the justification you need to not be bothered by solipsism and radical skepticism and stuff like that. I don't know if any of that made sense. I still feel like a pile of garbage right now. but that's how I would start to deal with some of those, I guess, concerns apart from Wittgenstein or those guys. Jim and Pat, what is your standard Lent routine? No comfort food, no TV, etc. Jim, do you have a standard Lent routine?
I don't know that I have a standard. I don't know that I have a standard, but I'll give something up for Lent. Right. It's sort of weird when you're already like really, really disciplined, like coming up, like it gets costly what you give up, right?
Yeah, no kidding. One year I did that Exodus 90 thing. I don't know if you've seen this. It's it's pretty popular, and it's so I mean, some parts weren't bad because it was stuff that I already do a lot. I mean, already doing a lot of fasting, already doing the intense exercise, but it was the things I hated were the cold showers, which we've talked about before. So that was a good ascetic discipline for me because it was something I really don't like to do.
And you live in Wisconsin.
And I live in Wisconsin. I don't know what this year is gonna look like. Because we follow we already have our sort of liturgical calendar we follow, and like today's Friday, so I'm doing an extended fast today anyways. I don't eat meat on Fridays, so I have a lot of these disciplines already in place. And usually Lent, it's just often a time where you kind of turn up the dial a little bit,
And I have to negotiate this with Jen, right? It's like if I give up sushi, then I'm kind of dragging her into giving up sushi, right? So stuff like that, so I always have to like figure out, what I give up. I'm not pulling Jen along with me, so.
Yeah, that's true. You do have to think about how it's going to affect, relationships and family members. And I mean, take anything you want from me, but do not take my sushi.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
Gan says, how would you go about showing somebody convinced of scientism that philosophy is much more than just quote fancy words? Enjoying your content very much, and God bless. All right, Tim, so why don't we talk about what scientism is and then try and answer this very good question.
Sure. Well, I think a couple things go under the moniker of scientism. Just to
sorry, go ahead and pull it back up if you want.
And like, okay, so you could mean by scientism, right, that the only possible way of gaining any kind of objective truth is through the application of the modern scientific method, right? You could, or one could say too, like the all things being equal, because other methods have been so unsuccessful in like producing consensus, right? We're only going to trust the scientific method, right? So I think like exactly what is meant by scientism, right, will make a difference here, right? If if the claim is that, hey, science is the only possible, the natural scientific method is the only possible way of obtaining truth, there's a kind of the classic, self-refuting problem there, in that, well, that doesn't seem to be something you could do, you could justify unless unless you could do it by the scientific method, which of course that's not a method that could be that would justify that claim, right? So that strong sort of scientism is not actually itself something that we could have a scientific justification for, right? Okay, so that there's that problem. If someone wants to say that, look, and this is kind of what Kant does in some ways, right? It doesn't seem that there's any other means of arriving at truth that actually produces consensus, right, than what we can get through the modern scientific method. Then I think that's a harder thing to deal with, okay, because there is a point to be made there, right, that it does seem, and this is one of the things that impressed people so much in the early modern period, was that science was a consensus maker in a way that no other discipline had been in the history of the world, right?
That's right, yeah.
Right, okay. Now, here's the deal, though, is it seems that at this point, like, it may be too late for us to like start appealing to now scientific consensus as a criterion, because like what is or is not scientific consensus is itself something that's become something of a vexed issue for us.
It's actually become a person, and his name is Fauci.
Yeah, exactly, right. I mean, and so Um, and also, so leaving aside like those, and I think those are legitimate things to bring up, but leaving that aside, I think another way to go with this kind of concern is to say, well, that actually like something could in fact be true, right, and well justified, and yet not produce consensus, right? Because the means of the justification may be something that is not really accessible to everyone, or it is subject to certain kinds of defeat that other kinds of claims are not, right? Okay, and I think this is basically my view, is to say, well, look, just because philosophy doesn't produce a lot of consensus doesn't mean there aren't actual justified views based on philosophical methods, right? It just might mean that consensus is much harder earned in philosophy, maybe unearnable, right? Okay, but that doesn't follow there's no philosophical truths, right?
Yes. Yeah, really good. I think you're right that scientism has many different flavors, like Chobani yogurt. But I mean, primarily there's sort of like epistemological scientism. The only things we can know are the things that come through the hypothetico-deductive method, or there's ontological scientism, right? The only thing
Yeah,
that exists is just say what physics tells us exists,
yeah,
right? And I think that there's myriad issues with both of those. Jim articulated a number. But I think fundamentally the problem is scientism is either going to face issues of self-defeat, like Jim articulated, or it's just going to become trivial because somebody's just going to kind of like expand a definition of science to just include things that we traditionally thought of as being philosophy anyways, right?
yeah,
So if you have a kind of, I guess, more restricted view of science, um, like, it seems pretty clear that science sort of runs off and a ton of different assumptions that it cannot justify or secure by itself. I mean, science assumes mathematics, it assumes logic, it assumes the reality of the external world, right? Which you were just talking about, right? Science can't prove any of these things. It also assumes morality, right? Because it assumes that we shouldn't lie about our test results, we shouldn't lie about our findings, right? Can't justify any of that, right? It just has to sort of just take it for granted. And so, those are all, I would argue, properly philosophical questions. I would also argue that science presupposes the principle of sufficient reason, right? That's something that can only be really defended and articulated philosophically. So, yeah. Now, if somebody wants to say, well, hey, logic, math, philosophy, that's all science, right? It's like, okay, whatever, then sure, right?
well, yeah, I mean, and actually originally that's how it would have been put, right?
Mhm.
You know what I mean? Like the sciences were just wisdom, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, somebody actually asked that question here in the comment the other day, is like, how did the sort of the ancients think about science? Well, they just thought about it as really any or generally organized body of knowledge, right?
Right,
That's just
right,
and sort of scientists as we know them now, originally kind of went under the term of being a natural philosopher,
right,
right?
right.
All right, Jim's got another question.
So this is Jate
Yate,
asks
perhaps.
Yate. Hello, Pat and Jim. My question is, how do I answer an atheist that objects that God is only the product of the mind to find purpose and meaning? Okay. Um, well, look, I think that the thing there is you would only give that kind of like after the fact psychological explanation. Like you believe this because, and then fill in your psychological explanation. You need meaning and purpose, etc., etc. On the assumption that there wasn't some other good reason to think that God exists, right? So, uh, could it be true that many people simply fall into theism because they're looking for, uh, something to give their lives meaning and purpose, and God actually exists, and there'd be good reasons for it? Yes. Okay. So I think you could give this explanation of a lot of believers, right? That they've not really thought about this at any rational level. It's a meaning mechanism, and maybe they've gotten into it for not entirely good reasons. Okay. I agree with that. And I think we could give that explanation. I think I wouldn't doubt that there's social science that could be done to support that explanation. Okay. I think a lot of people's beliefs could be explained this way. Okay. But that doesn't mean there is no God. And that doesn't mean there aren't good reasons independent of people's psychological needs to think that there's a God. Right. And so my point is like what the objector is doing here is not actually making an argument against God's existence, or even making an argument against like your particular reasons for thinking God exists. He or she is observing what may well be a sociological fact, right? But that it's completely irrelevant to whether or not indeed God exists.
Right. Yeah, this is a pretty famous fallacy that C.S. Lewis gave the term Bulverism to, where you start explaining why somebody's wrong without first showing that they are
Yeah.
wrong. Right. Now, if this person had an argument, right, against the existence of God and felt that argument was decisive, like then it becomes, I think, interesting and legitimate to begin to seek out psychological explanations. Okay, like this thing is false. Here's why it's false. Now let's try and explain to you why you believe false things, right? But if you start trying to give this psychological just so story, which might actually be true, that has no bearing really on the sort of the ontology, right? The question of whether God actually exists. It might just well be the case. In fact, I know people who just said, hey, look, I gave up my atheism because it seemed to commit me to nihilism. And I choose to believe in God because that does give my life meaning. I know people who say that, right? And that doesn't bother me because I think there's good reasons to think that God exists, right?
The vast majority of people believe in any really like interesting scientific truths simply be out of a kind of social conformity, a trust for authority, a desire to fit in, what have you, right? I mean, the vast majority of people are the ability to actually prove those scientific truths is beyond them, and they've never really given it a second thought, though they would give their allegiance to it, right?
Yeah.
So we could give a psychological explanation of most of our beliefs in science, right? For the layperson, right?
And indeed atheism. I mean, there's been work on this of like, hey, the only reason you're atheist, buddy, is because you had issues with your dad, or there was an abandonment with your father, and now you're projecting that onto your metaphysics, right?
But see, my point is the fact that there is, a less than flattering psychological explanation for, belief among relatively unreflective people is no strike against whether or not there could be a good reason for that belief. It's just that most people don't have it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I don't doubt that you could, like a lot of people, maybe most religious believers are relatively unreflective in it, and they're helping themselves to things that they couldn't give reasons for, et cetera, et cetera. That doesn't mean there aren't reasons for it. Right?
Yeah. And it doesn't mean that you're not even justified or warranted in your belief of God, because that's going to come down to your epistemology. And if something like Plantinga's account of proper functionalism is correct, then that's not an issue, right? You can be perfectly rational in your belief in God without being able to articulate any of the, say, the philosophical arguments that we cover, And let's be honest, that's going to be the case for most people, right? Let's take a fitness question here, just mix it up a little bit. Pete said, good way. He wants to know, what is a good way to begin fasting, calorie cycling for longevity and sustainability? My goal is to get and stay lean without a lot of thought and a busy, fluctuating schedule. I work 3 nights and 2 days a week right now. So, Pete, I'm going to recommend that you just do a very basic 5-2 diet. I think that is a really good way to start. In fact, my second For Dummies book that I wrote with Wiley was called, it was terribly titled. It was called Fast Diets for Dummies. Quick story. I have to get this off my chest because it annoys me to this day. All my For Dummies books were awfully titled, and I tried as hard as I could to resist those titles, but this is just the nature of working with a publisher of that gigantic size. And so at first I said, okay, let's call this book Fasting for Dummies, because what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the benefits of fasting and the different ways of doing it. And they said, no, that sounds religious. All right. So I'm like, all right, well, let's call it Intermittent Fasting for Dummies. And they said, no, that sounds too complicated. I'm like, all right, what do you want to call it? They're like, well, let's call it Fast Diets for Dummies. I'm like, oh, well, that's not confusing at all, right? So it got that title. And then they released a book later actually called Intermittent Fasting for Dummies. And so anyways, that's stupid, but that's just the history of that book. But anyways, 5-2 diet's this, man, just 2 days a week. You just slash your calories, right? And it could be something as simple as you could do Wednesday and Friday. And your first meal isn't until lunch. And then for lunch, you just have a light lunch. Maybe it's a protein shake. Maybe it's a salad. Maybe it's like a soup or a stew, but healthy and light. So not very heavily caloried. And then you have a sort of, moderate, reasonable dinner as well. So all in all, you might be pretty low caloried on those 2 days, maybe even like 1,000 to 1,200 calories. And then the rest of the week, you eat normal, but you eat healthy. I think that's a really good way to start. There's a lot going for it. It's very practical. It fits well with a busy schedule. It's not too intense. And it's a good way to just ease yourself into intermittent fasting. Jim, what are your recommendations here?
Yeah, I mean, I do really well with at least a 16-hour daily fast. A lot of times it's more like 20, and then 1 day a week of full fast. I find that's pretty no-brainer. It's pretty routine for me now, right?
Yeah, that's the maybe it might help just to give the range of options. So the 5-2 is just 2 days a week. Kind of you do a fast and your calories go down. There's the classic 16-8 approach, which is kind of what Jim's talking about, where you have, daily 16-hour fast and you have this sort of 8-hour eating window. Other people have an even longer fasting period and a shorter eating window. That's sort of the warrior diet approach. It's something more like a 20-hour fast and a 4-hour eating window.
It's kind of where I'm at.
And then, there's another approach where you can just do 5 days a week where you're just like lower caloried, and then 2 days a week where you kind of boost the calories. I think any of those are good starting options. Just pick, what you think is going to be most suitable for your lifestyle, but people have success with all of those. All right. Yeah, Jim, continue to grab anything that you want here.
There's a question. Parker asked, as Catholic Christians with philosophers today and in recent past, do you think we should be interacting with and even synthesizing similar to how Aquinas did with Aristotle, some Islamic figures? I don't think we can know that without reading all his philosophers. So I would say read them all and investigate them all, and if they're what is worthy, keep, and what is not, reject. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I don't think there's any need to set up front. I have spent far more time in recent years reading, the German tradition from Hegel into Heidegger, and then like some of the French stuff with Merleau-Ponty, and it has fundamentally changed a lot of the ways I think. I don't know that I can synthesize it with Thomas, but it has changed a lot of the ways I think. So I think one should be a lifelong learner, right? And keep reading stuff.
Mikey says, did you guys see the Matt Walsh debate on Dr. Phil, where he destroyed transgenderism with one question? What is a woman? I did not see that. I don't catch Dr. Phil ever at all. That's interesting that they had that.
Whoever
debate.
The guest is, I'm not going to make the mistake of watching Dr. Phil. So,
but I will say, if you did not hear our conversation on the Philosophy for the People channel with Dr. Thomas Bogardus, please check that out. He has a number of papers out now critiquing modern gender ideology. And one of them, it focuses on this sort of what he calls the trans inclusion problem, which is kind of getting at, I think, maybe what Matt Walsh was articulating. But there does seem to be this issue of trying, if you're going to move away from our traditional understanding of what a woman is, an adult, biological human female, then it seems like you're going to have you're going to have a lot of issues. One is that it seems like you're either going to have like a circular definition, which seems unacceptable, or you're going to have to like park the definition in certain stereotypes that are not desirable for reasons of just being definitionally inadequate, but also people don't generally like that. Like a woman is somebody that likes dolls and cooking or something like that, right? Yeah. But the other thing is, if you start to put the definition in something aside from the traditional understanding, you'll seem to always kind of exclude people. If you're into the I guess the transgender stuff, you always kind of exclude people that you want to be included, or you'll include people that shouldn't, that should be excluded, right? And Bogardus's argument is that this is impossible. This is an impossible project, right? You're never going to be able to solve the trans exclusion problem, and this isn't, this shouldn't be surprising because the whole thing's essentially nonsense to begin with. Right. Yeah. So this again is one of those things like, what would the difference be, Jim, between the asylum and going and hanging out with a bunch of professional gender philosophers, right? I don't know if I'd be able to tell the difference, honestly.
It would be difficult to tell the difference.
Right. So, yeah, interesting. All right, let's see.
What do we got here?
A lot of good questions, guys. As always, sorry if we don't hit yours or can't take them all, but this one relates to something we talked about. Catholic Base wants to know how should Catholics evaluate or use Reformed epistemology? I'm broadly a fan, right? I don't go with Plantinga on everything. I think if you're a student or just interested in epistemology, then you have to read, at least Warrant and Proper Function by Plantinga.
Yep.
That to me is just a quintessential text. And there's a great debate, especially among Thomists, of where kind of Aquinas falls. But I've been increasingly persuaded by Eleanor Stump's account that Aquinas is closer to Plantinga than even Plantinga thinks Aquinas is. So yeah, no, I myself very much lean in that sort of broadly Reedian direction, and have much to sympathize with Plantinga. And there are cases being made by many Thomists that even Aquinas himself fell into that camp. And then Stump actually uses that to link and give reason to thinking that maybe even Aristotle himself was something of an externalist, which is controversial to say the least. But Jim, maybe you have some thoughts on that.
Yeah, I don't. I have no objections against Reformed epistemology. It's not the way I have gone to think about religious belief, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so maybe we should try and even explain what Reformed epistemology is, because sometimes we get questions that get brought up that I'm sure a lot of people have no background about. How would you briefly try to explain Plantinga's project, I guess?
Well, I mean, so you have to make it so for Plantinga, you have to make a distinction between warrant and justification, right?
Mm-hmm.
And by justification, he basically means that like you're justified for belief if you have access to the conditions of by which you could know it to be true, right? And but through various counterexamples that were given, in the 60s and 70s, people started seeing that it seems quite possible that you could have justified beliefs that turned out to be false, right? Obviously. Which would you don't want to call that knowledge then, and you could have unjustified beliefs that turned out true, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and so Plantinga added the notion of warrant, and what warrant is not only like it's not having the reasons for the belief at your direct access, but it's just being in the right relationship with the world such that you are epistemically okay in holding the belief.
Right. Warrant is that sort of quality that takes, justified belief to knowledge. And for Plantinga, it can also be degreed as well.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And Plantinga makes the point, like you cannot have justification all the way down, right? Otherwise you're going to get an infinite regress. Okay. So at bottom, there must be some of our beliefs are warranted. They're not justified. We're just in the right position to have the right belief. Okay. And what warrants it is our relationship to something external to us, nothing internal to us, right? There's no evidence that we can cite. It's just that we're in the right relationship to the world, and that's why we have this belief, okay? And that's where the notion of proper function comes, is like you'll have certain warranted beliefs if your cognitive apparatus is operating properly, okay?
In the environment it was meant to operate in, and so on and so forth, right?
Mm-hmm. Okay, but once you take that turn, like what is or is not warranted is going to be an interesting question, right? And in Plantinga's long-term project is to say, his magnum opus is called warranted Christian belief. And he's saying, well, it could be that our religious beliefs are warranted, but not justified. I can't give you the reasons for them, but yet I still have it and it's true. And I have it and it's true because I'm in the right relationship to reality. Right.
And I can hold it in a basic way as a basic belief, right? So the idea there is that essentially, if God exists and if Christianity is true, then you can be perfectly rational and warranted in believing, say, the truths of the gospel, even independent of you not having access to conditions where you can make arguments for it, for example, right? Mm-hmm. So yeah, he's got this famous line, like, if this is true, right, then we've got warrant for it. If it's not true, then we don't, right? So,
But
yeah.
I probably need to wrap up because I got a class that starts in a few minutes here.
Yeah, groovy, man. Hey, anything
If
you
you
want to
wanna keep
announce
it
or
in-
say? Nah, I'm gonna go take some cough drops, man.
Go drink a bottle of cough syrup.
I see there's a lot of good stuff here we didn't get to. Just gentle listeners, hold on to your questions and submit them next time. We never mind repeats if we missed yours this time. We want to appreciate you guys. As always, you make these episodes a lot of fun. We hope that we've been some help. So please like, comment, share, subscribe. That stuff makes a difference. Jim, anything you want to add before we wrap up?
No, but hey, feel free to go ahead and purchase yourself a copy of the Nihilism course. So at jdmadden.com. Right.
And where is, let me get the link. Here it is, jdmadden.com/philosophy-course. Check it out. Support the good professor.
Excellent.
And sounds good, guys. We'll be back here with you in not too long of a time. So God bless and see you later.